I work in the oil fields up in Alaska. I've been doing it for about 12 years now, and the isolation never bothered me much. When you spend weeks at a time on remote drilling sites with nothing but tundra and darkness around you, you get used to being alone. That October in 2021, I decided to take a week off and do some hunting up near Denali. I had been looking at this rental cabin online for months, one of those old trapper places about 40 miles northeast of the park entrance. The listing showed it was built in the 1960s, single-room construction with a loft, wood stove for heat, and no running water. The price was dirt cheap, only $45 a night, which should have been my first red flag. The property management company said it had belonged to a local trapper named Gerald Hutchins, who died back in 2019, and his family was trying to sell it but renting it out in the meantime to cover property taxes. I figured it was perfect. Remote enough that I would not see another person all week, close enough to good hunting grounds, and cheap enough that I could afford to stay the whole 7 days without breaking my budget. I drove up on a Monday morning, October 18th, in my Ford F-250, pulling a small utility trailer with my four-wheeler camping gear and hunting equipment. The last 8 miles to the cabin were on this barely maintained dirt road that turned into more of a suggestion than an actual path. My GPS lost signal about halfway in, but the property manager had sent me detailed directions with landmarks. Turn left at the lightning-struck spruce, right at the creek crossing with the blue paint marker, straight through the meadow until you see the red metal roof. When I finally pulled up to the place around 2:00 in the afternoon, it looked exactly like the photos. Small, maybe 400 square feet total, including the loft, with log walls that had gone gray from weather and age. The roof was that standing seam metal, painted red but faded to almost pink in spots. There was a covered porch on the front, with a stack of split firewood under a tarp, and a small outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. The key was supposed to be under a rock by the front steps, and it was right where they said, along with a handwritten note with instructions about the wood stove and a reminder to pack out all trash. Inside, the place was basic but functional. One main room with the wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a propane camp stove and some shelves, a table with 2 chairs, and a lumpy couch that looked older than me. The loft was accessed by a ladder and had a double mattress up there with some wool blankets that smelled like mothballs. Everything was clean enough, just old and worn. I spent the first afternoon getting settled, bringing in my gear, starting a fire in the wood stove, and checking out the surrounding area. The forest was thick with black spruce and birch, and I could hear a creek running somewhere to the west. I saw fresh moose tracks near the tree line, which was promising for the hunt. That first night was peaceful. I made some freeze-dried stew on the camp stove, read a book by lantern light, and turned in around 10. The mattress was uncomfortable, but I had slept on worse at drill sites. The second day was perfect hunting weather. Cold, clear, maybe 28 degrees with a light breeze from the north. I spent the whole day out on the four-wheeler covering ground, seeing plenty of sign but not getting a clean shot at anything. Got back to the cabin around 6 degrees when it was already getting dark, cooked some rice and canned chicken, and fell asleep exhausted by 9:30. That was when the knocking started. I woke up to it at exactly 2:47 a.m. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, thinking maybe someone was out there needing help or that another hunter had gotten turned around in the dark. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock, then nothing. I laid there, listening for maybe 2 minutes, hearing only the wind moving through the trees and the occasional pop from the wood stove as the fire burned down. Then 3 more knocks, same rhythm, same volume. I grabbed my headlamp and boots, climbing down from the loft as quietly as I could. The knocking was coming from the back door, a small side entrance I had not even used since I arrived. I stood there in the main room, my heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The cabin had no windows on that wall, just the door, so I could not see who or what was out there. I called out, asking if anyone needed help, but there was no response, just silence. Then 3 more knocks. I moved closer to the door, put my hand on the handle, and was about to open it when something stopped me cold. The knocking was coming from low on the door, maybe 3 feet off the ground, too low for a standing person. I backed away from the door and went to the front window, shining my headlamp out into the darkness. The beam did not reach far, maybe 40 feet before it got swallowed by the forest, but in that limited circle of light, I could see fresh snow had fallen while I slept, maybe an inch or 2 coating everything. And there were no footprints. None leading to the cabin, none around the sides that I could see from the window. Just pristine, undisturbed snow. I stood there trying to make sense of that when I heard the knocking again, but this time it was coming from a different location. The front door now, same pattern. 3 slow knocks. I moved away from the window and grabbed my rifle, chambering around even though I had no idea what I would be shooting at. The knocking moved again, this time to the window I had just been looking out of. 3 knocks on the glass, methodical, patient. Then silence. For the next hour, the knocking moved around the cabin in a slow circuit. Back door, side window, front door, other side window, loft window, always 3 knocks, always the same. Rhythm. Always at a height that made no sense for a person standing in the snow. I sat on the couch with my rifle across my lap, watching the windows, listening to this thing circle my cabin over and over. At some point around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off from exhaustion because when I jerked awake, it was getting light outside and the knocking had stopped. I waited until full daylight before I went outside, taking my rifle and doing a complete circle of the cabin. The snow was still there, melting slowly in the morning sun, and there were no footprints anywhere. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, nothing. Just the marks from my own feet where I had walked the day before. I checked the back door area specifically, looking for any sign of what had been knocking, but the snow within 10 feet of the door was completely untouched. I spent that whole day trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a branch hitting the cabin in the wind, except there was no wind strong enough to move branches like that. Maybe it was the cabin settling or the metal roof contracting in the cold, except it moved between different locations in a pattern that was clearly intentional. Maybe I had dreamed it, except I knew I had been awake. I had gotten up, grabbed my rifle, watched the clock. That night, I made sure to bank the fire good, so I would not have to get up, and I laid down, fully dressed, with my rifle next to me in the loft. I set my watch alarm for 2:45 a.m., determined to be ready if it happened again. When the alarm went off, I shut it down immediately and laid there in the darkness, listening. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, 3 knocks came from the back door. Same pattern, same rhythm. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight, a powerful LED that could light up 100 yards, and I went straight to the back door. I yanked it open fast, bringing the light and rifle up simultaneously, ready for whatever was there. Nothing. Just darkness and trees and snow that showed no tracks. I stepped outside in my boots, sweeping the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing moving, nothing making noise except my own breathing fogging in the cold air. Then I heard knocking behind me, inside the cabin, 3 slow knocks coming from somewhere in the main room. I spun around and went back through the door, and the knocking stopped. My flashlight beam swept across the room, catching on the frost that had formed on the inside of the windows. That was when I saw them. Handprints on the window glass from the inside. Small handprints like a child's, pressed against the cold glass from inside the cabin. But I was alone. I had been alone since I arrived. I backed toward the door, keeping my light and rifle up, checking every corner of the small room. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. The loft was open above me, empty except for the mattress and my sleeping bag. The main room had no closets, no cabinets big enough for a person. I was absolutely alone in that cabin, but someone or something had pressed their hands against that window from the inside while I was standing outside. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my rifle. Left everything else. I was in my truck and driving down that rough road within 5 minutes, not caring that it was 3 in the morning and pitch black. I drove until I hit the main highway, then pulled into the first gas station I found 40 miles later, sitting in the parking lot with the doors locked until the sun came up. I called the property management company that morning and told them I was not coming back, that I wanted a refund for the unused nights. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but not surprised. She asked if I had experienced anything unusual, and when I told her about the knocking and the handprints, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. Gerald Hutchins, the trapper who owned the cabin, had died there, in the loft, in the middle of the night. The coroner estimated time of death at 2:47 a.m. He had been found 3 days later when he missed a supply pickup in town. The family had cleaned out his belongings and tried to sell the place, but nobody would buy it once word got around about how he died. She said several other renters had left early, all reporting the same thing. Knocking at night. Always at 2:47 a.m. Always following the same pattern around the cabin. I got a partial refund, and I never went back for my gear. I told them to keep it or burn it. I did not care. The property management company sent me an email a month later, saying the cabin had been demolished. The family finally gave up trying to rent or sell it, and just had it torn down and burned. But I still think about those handprints on the window. Small hands, pressed against the glass from the inside of an empty cabin. I do not hunt alone anymore. I do not stay in remote cabins, and I do not ever want to hear that pattern of knocking again. I have been a wildlife photographer for about 8 years now, specializing in Arctic and subarctic species. Most of my work involves long periods of isolation in remote locations, setting up camera traps and motion-activated equipment to capture behavior that humans rarely witness. In January 2020, I got hired by a conservation foundation to document winter wolf migration patterns near the Arctic Circle in northern Alaska. The assignment was for 2 weeks, staying at a research cabin about 840 miles north of Fairbanks, accessible only by bush plane or snowmobile in winter. The cabin belonged to the university system and got used periodically by researchers studying everything from permafrost to caribou populations. I had stayed in similar places dozens of times before. Basic shelter, enough supplies to last through the assignment, and the kind of isolation that lets you really observe wildlife without human interference. The bush pilot who flew me in was a guy named Tom Rivera, maybe 55 years old, who'd been flying in Alaska for 30 years. He landed his Cessna 184 on skis on a frozen lake about a quarter mile from the cabin on January 12th, helped me unload my equipment, and gave me the standard safety briefing. He showed me the satellite phone, told me the emergency frequencies, reminded me about bear protocol even though they should all be hibernating, and said he would be back on January 26th unless I called him earlier. The cabin was small but well maintained, maybe 500 square feet with good insulation, a propane heater, propane stove, and a generator for charging batteries. There was a bunk bed, a work table, some shelves with supplies, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet. The previous researchers had left detailed notes about the generator schedule, the propane levels, and wildlife they had observed. Everything seemed professional and organized. I spent the first 3 days setting up my camera network. I had 12 motion-activated trail cameras that I positioned in a rough grid pattern covering about 4 square miles around the cabin, focusing on game trails, ridge lines, and areas where wolves were likely to travel. Each camera was programmed to take both photos and video when triggered, with timestamps and GPS coordinates embedded in the files. I also set up 2 cameras pointing at the cabin itself, one covering the front approach and one covering the lake, mainly for security and to document any wildlife that came close to the structure. By day 4, everything was operational, and I settled into the routine of checking SD cards every 2 days, downloading footage, and maintaining the equipment. The first week of footage was exactly what I hoped for. I captured a small pack of 5 wolves moving through on day 6, got excellent video of a lynx hunting snowshoe hares, documented a wolverine scent marking territory, and recorded hours of raven behavior. The weather was brutal, averaging 18 degrees, below zero during the day and dropping to 30 below at night. But the cabin stayed warm and my equipment held up fine. I was alone, but I had my satellite phone, my cameras, my work, and that was enough. On the evening of January 20th, when I downloaded the SD cards from my twice-weekly collection run, I noticed something odd on camera 7, the one positioned on a ridgeline about a mile northeast of the cabin. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. on January 19th. The motion sensor had been triggered by something moving between the spruce trees. The video was only 42 seconds long, but what it showed made me watch it 5 times trying to understand what I was seeing. Something tall was moving through the trees, not walking on all fours like a bear or moose, but upright on 2 legs. The figure was in the background, maybe 80 feet from the camera, partially obscured by vegetation, but clearly bipedal. At first, I thought maybe I had captured footage of another person, a trapper or hunter passing through, except the height was all wrong. Based on the known measurements of the trees in frame, whatever I was looking at stood at least 8 feet tall, possibly taller. The gait was strange too, not quite human, with longer strides than seemed natural. The video quality was good, 1080p resolution, but the subject was far enough away and moving through enough vegetation that I could not make out clear details. Just this tall, dark shape moving through the forest at 3:30 in the morning in 25 below temperatures. I went through the rest of the SD cards methodically. Camera 3, positioned on a game trail half a mile south of the cabin, had captured a similar figure on January 18th at 1:52 a.m. Same bipedal movement, same excessive height. Camera 9, which covered an open area near a frozen creek, showed tracks in fresh snow from January 17th. The tracks were massive, easily 18 inches long, and the stride length between prints measured 6 feet. I spent that entire evening going through every frame I had, making notes, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a moose filmed at an angle that made it look bipedal. Maybe the height estimates were off due to perspective. Maybe the tracks were bear tracks that had melted and refrozen larger. But none of those explanations held up when I really examined the evidence. That night, I made sure both the cabin cameras were functioning properly, and I moved one of my handheld cameras to the window by my bunk, pointing it outside with the motion sensor activated. I did not sleep well. Every sound the cabin made, every creak of the walls contracting in the cold, every gust of wind had me wide awake and listening. Nothing happened that night, or the next day, or the next night. On January 22nd, I did my regular SD card collection run. When I got to camera 7, the one on the northeast ridge, I found the SD card was missing. Not damaged, not malfunctioned, but physically removed from the camera. The weatherproof case was still locked, but someone or something had opened it, taken the card, and closed it again. I checked every other camera in the network. 4 more were missing their SD cards. Cameras 3, 9, 11, and 12. All of them had captured footage of either the tall figure or the massive tracks. I hiked back to the cabin faster than I should have, slipping twice on ice patches, my heart hammering the entire way. When I got back, I immediately went to my laptop to check the backup files I had downloaded 4 days earlier. Every video file from those 5 cameras was corrupted. The files were there. They showed the correct file sizes, but when I tried to open them, I got error messages. The only footage that remained intact was the video from camera 7 that I had watched repeatedly, because I had copied it to a separate USB drive to study it more closely. Everything else showing that figure was gone. I sat there staring at my laptop screen, trying to understand how this was possible. Someone would have had to break into the cabin, access my laptop, and selectively corrupt specific files, but the cabin had been locked every time I left. The door showed no signs of forced entry, and I had been alone out here for 10 days. There was no one else within 50 miles. That night, January 22nd, I could not sleep at all. I kept the propane heater running high, kept all the lights on, and sat at the work table with my laptop and the satellite phone within reach. At 2:33 a.m., the motion sensor on my handheld camera by the window triggered. I grabbed the camera and played back the footage. Something had walked past the window, slowly, taking maybe 10 seconds to cross the 6-foot width of the window frame. And it had stopped in the middle and turned toward the glass. Toward me. The footage was dark, lit only by the faint glow from the cabin lights reflecting off the snow, but I could see a shape. Tall, easily 8 feet, with proportions that were almost human, but stretched and wrong. And it had stood there, looking in at me for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, according to the timestamp. I had been sitting at that table 6 feet from that window, working on my laptop and drinking coffee, while something stood outside in 30 below temperatures, watching me for 4 hours. I had not heard anything, had not seen any movement, had no idea it was there until I checked the camera. I called Tom Rivera on the satellite phone at 7 a.m. when I knew he would be awake. Told him I needed an emergency extraction, that I was cutting the assignment short, and that I needed him to come get me as soon as possible. He said he could be there by noon if the weather held. I spent the next 5 hours packing my essential equipment, leaving most of the cameras and gear behind. I just wanted out. When I heard the plane's engine approaching around 11:45, I grabbed my bags and headed for the lake. Tom landed smoothly, taxiing the Cessna close to shore, but he did not shut down. The engine. When I got close enough to see his face through the cockpit window, he looked confused and kept gesturing for me to hurry up. I threw my bags in, climbed into the passenger seat, and he immediately started turning the plane around for takeoff. I asked him what was wrong, and he pointed back toward the tree line on the far side of the lake. There were people standing there. At least that is what it looked like from 400 yards away. Maybe a dozen figures spread out along the tree line, motionless, watching the plane. Tom said they had been there when he approached for landing, and it made him nervous because he had not seen any other planes in the area and could not figure out how that many people got out here. He said something felt wrong about them, about the way they stood, about how they had not moved or waved or shown any normal human behavior. As we lifted off and gained altitude, I looked back. The figures were still there, and from the higher vantage point I could see they were too tall, too still, and positioned in a way that suggested they had been waiting. Not for Tom, for me. Back in Fairbanks, I took the footage to a professor I knew at the university, someone who specialized in video analysis and digital forensics. He spent 3 days examining the clips, checking for tampering, analyzing the metadata, and trying to enhance the distant shots of the figure in the trees. His conclusion was that the footage was genuine, unmanipulated, and showed something that he could not identify. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. The height was wrong for a human. The behavior of standing motionless in lethal cold for hours was wrong for any living thing. He wrote it up as an unexplained phenomenon and submitted it to a wildlife journal, but they declined to publish without more evidence or corroboration. I kept the USB drive with the footage in a safe deposit box. I told the Conservation Foundation that I had experienced equipment failures and could not complete the assignment. They understood and paid me for the days I was there. I never went back to collect the rest of my cameras. The university sent some graduate students out there in March to retrieve the equipment and close up the cabin for the season. They reported that every single camera in my network was still in place, but all of them had their SD cards missing. The cabin showed no signs of disturbance. The only thing they found that was unusual was tracks in old snow near the cabin. Very large tracks. The students photographed them, and sent the images to a wildlife biologist who said they did not match any known species in Alaska. I still do wildlife photography, but I do not work in Alaska anymore. I do not do winter assignments, and I do not stay alone in remote locations. I switched to urban wildlife projects, documenting coyotes in Los Angeles, raccoons in Toronto, foxes in London. Animals that I understand, animals that behave in predictable ways, because whatever was watching me from outside that cabin window for 4 hours while I sat drinking coffee, whatever walked on 2 legs through the forest at impossible heights, whatever took those SD cards and corrupted those files, that was not an animal I understand, and I do not ever want to see it again. I work as a geologist for a mining exploration company based out of Anchorage. Have been doing it for about 18 years now, mostly conducting surveys and mineral assessments at remote sites across Alaska. The work involves a lot of solo time in the wilderness, drilling core samples, mapping geological formations, and compiling data for feasibility reports. In March 2018, my company sent me to evaluate a potential copper deposit about 90 miles south of Fairbanks near the Denali Highway. The assignment was straightforward. 7 days on site, collect samples, assess the grade and extent of mineralization, and submit a preliminary report on whether the claim was worth developing further. The company maintained a small cabin at the location, built back in the 1980s during the last exploration phase, and supposedly kept in reasonable condition for exactly these kinds of surveys. I drove out on March 12th in a company truck, a reinforced Ford F-350 with heavy-duty snow tires and emergency equipment. The last 20 miles were on unmaintained winter roads that required 4-wheel drive and careful navigation around drifts and ice patches. I arrived at the cabin around 4 gas in the afternoon, with maybe 2 hours of daylight left. The structure was exactly where the GPS coordinates indicated, a small log building maybe 600 square feet, with a metal roof and a covered porch stacked with firewood. The key was supposed to be in a lockbox mounted next to the door, and the combination was in my assignment folder. Everything matched the description. I unlocked the cabin, brought in my gear, and started getting settled before darkness made everything harder. Inside, the place was basic but functional. 1 large room with a wood stove, a kitchenette with a propane stove and small refrigerator that ran off a generator, a table with 2 chairs, and a set of bunk beds against the far wall. There was a small bathroom with a chemical toilet and a gravity-fed water system that drew from a cistern on the roof. The previous survey team had left notes about the generator schedule, the propane levels, and contact information for the nearest ranger station, which was about 35 miles away. What I noticed immediately, though, was graffiti carved into the wooden wall above the table. Not spray paint or marker, but actual carvings, deep gouges in the wood forming names and dates. I walked over to examine them more closely, running my fingers over the rough cuts. There were maybe a dozen names, all carved in different handwriting styles but with similar depths, like they had all been done with the same tool. A knife, probably, or something equally sharp. Next to each name was a date: Sarah Mitchell, March 2014, James Corver, August 2015, Angela Reeves, October 2016, David Santos, June 2017. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for some of the names, mostly out of curiosity. What I found made my stomach tighten. Sarah Mitchell had been a 29-year-old graduate student from the University of Alaska who went missing during a solo research trip in 2014. Her car was found abandoned near the Denali Highway, but she was never located. James Corver was a hunting guide who disappeared in 2015. Angela Reeves was a backpacker whose case was still open. David Santos was a fishing guide who vanished without a trace. I searched 4 more names from the wall. Every single one was a missing person, all of them from Alaska, all of them within the last 5 years, all of them still unsolved. I spent the first hour after that discovery going through the cabin systematically, looking for anything else unusual, but there was nothing. Just standard cabin supplies, some canned food, basic tools, and the notes from previous survey teams. None of the official company logs mentioned the carvings. Either they had not noticed them, or they had chosen not to report them. I considered calling my supervisor, but what would I tell him? That there were names on the wall, and some of them matched missing persons cases. It could be a coincidence. It could be someone's dark idea of a joke. I decided to document everything with photos, complete my work as assigned, and report it all when I got back to Anchorage. That night, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and slept with my satellite phone and my pistol within arm's reach. The next 4 days were focused on work. I hiked out each morning to the claim sites, drilled core samples, logged the geology, and took measurements. The mineralization was decent, not spectacular, but enough to potentially justify further exploration. Each evening, I returned to the cabin, cooked something simple, reviewed my notes, and tried not to stare at those names carved into the wall. But every night before I turned in, I found myself counting them, confirming they were the same 12 names, same dates, nothing new. On the evening of March 16th, my 4th night in the cabin, something changed. I'd just finished dinner and was sitting at the table updating my field notebook when I glanced at the wall. There was a new carving. Fresh wood shavings were still visible in the grooves, pale against the darker aged wood of the wall. The name was Dylan Pratt, my name. And next to it was a date, March 17th, 2018, tomorrow. I stood up so fast the chair tipped over backward. My heart was slamming against my ribs as I moved closer to the wall, touching the new carving, feeling the sharp edges of the fresh cuts. The wood was still slightly damp where the blade had gone deep. This had been done recently, within the last few hours. While I was sitting at that table with my back to the wall, someone had been in this cabin. I spun around, scanning every corner of the single room. The door was still locked from the inside. The chair I had wedged under the handle the night before was right where I had left it that morning. The windows were all latched. There was no attic access, no crawl space, nowhere for someone to hide. I was alone, but I was not alone. Someone had carved my name into that wall. Someone knew I was here. Someone had marked tomorrow as my date. I grabbed my satellite phone and called my supervisor. It was after hours, but this was an emergency. He did not answer. I left a voicemail explaining the situation, saying I was evacuating immediately, and that he needed to call me back as soon as he got the message. Then I started packing. I threw my essential equipment into my backpack, grabbed my samples, my notes, my pistol, and headed for the door. That was when I heard voices outside. Not shouting, not calling for help, just conversation. Multiple people talking in low tones like they were standing on the porch having a casual discussion. I moved to the window and looked out. There was no one there. The porch was empty. The truck was sitting right where I had parked it, undisturbed, but the voices continued clear and distinct coming from directly outside the door. One voice was talking about the weather, mentioning how cold it had gotten, how the ice on the roads was getting dangerous. Another voice responded, saying something about needing to finish before morning, about not having much time. A third voice, this one female, said my name, said Dylan was inside, said I would try to leave, said they needed to make sure I stayed until tomorrow. I stood there, with my hand on the door handle, frozen, listening to these voices discuss me like I was not even there, like I was already gone. Then one of them said something that made my blood turn to ice. The voice said I should look at the wall again, that there was more I needed to see, that I needed to understand how it worked. I turned back toward the table, toward that wall with all those names, and in the dim light from my lantern, I saw something I had missed before. Below each name, carved much smaller, almost hidden in the grain of the wood, were additional words. Locations: Sarah Mitchell, Mile 47, Denali Highway; James Corver, Creek Bend, 2 miles north; Angela Reeves, Treefall Zone, East Ridge; David Santos, Lake Shore, South Access; and below my name, freshly carved like the name itself, were the words "generator shed" behind cabin. That was where they were going to find me. That was where whatever happened was supposed to happen. I looked at the date again, March 17th. Tomorrow. The voices outside had stopped talking. The silence was worse than the sound had been. I made a decision. I was not staying until tomorrow. I was not waiting to see if that carved date meant anything. I grabbed my pack, checked that my pistol was loaded, and I went to the back window, the one that faced away from the porch and the truck. I unlocked it as quietly as I could, pushed it open and squeezed through, dropping down into the snow on the other side. The cold hit me immediately, maybe 15 degrees, and I was not dressed for a long hike, but I started moving. Anyway, heading south through the trees, away from the cabin, away from the voices, away from that wall with my name and tomorrow's date carved into it. I hiked for maybe 2 hours, using my headlamp and GPS, following a rough bearing toward where I knew the Denali Highway should be. My legs burned. My lungs ached from the cold air, but I kept moving. Around midnight, I reached the highway and flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck with a local couple heading back from Cantwell. They took one look at me, half frozen and wild-eyed, and did not ask many questions. Just got me in the truck, turned the heat on full blast, and drove me to the nearest town with a state trooper station. I told the trooper everything: the names on the wall, the missing persons cases, the fresh carving with my name, and the next day's date, the voices outside the cabin. He listened, took notes, and said they would send someone out to investigate the cabin in the morning. He asked if I wanted medical attention, but I just wanted to get back to Anchorage, back to civilization, back to somewhere that made sense. 2 days later, my supervisor called. The state troopers had gone to the cabin. They found my gear, found the names carved in the wall, but there was no fresh carving with my name. The wall showed only the original 12 names, aged and weathered. No Dylan Pratt, no March 17th, no generator shed location. The troopers checked the generator shed anyway, just to be thorough, and they found something. Human remains. Partial skeleton buried in the dirt floor under some old equipment. Forensics later identified them as belonging to James Corver, the hunting guide who disappeared in 2015. His name was on that wall. His location was on that wall. But my name, which I had seen carved fresh with wood shavings still visible, was not there when the police arrived. The company closed that survey site permanently, listed the location as unsuitable for development due to the ongoing investigation. The state eventually found remains matching 3 more of the names from that wall, all within a 2-mile radius of the cabin. The other cases remain open. I transferred to desk work immediately. I do not go into the field anymore. I do not stay in remote cabins. And I never found out why my name disappeared from that wall, or what would have happened if I had stayed until March 17th, like the carving said I should. I am a writer, have been publishing novels for about 9 years now, mostly psychological thrillers and mystery fiction. The work requires long stretches of focused concentration, and I learned early on that I do my best writing in complete isolation, away from the distractions of city life and internet connectivity. In November 2022, I decided to rent a cabin for a 2-week writing retreat to finish the final draft of my 6th novel. I found a place on Airbnb near the Kenai Peninsula, about 65 miles south of Anchorage, advertised as a writer's paradise with no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just peace and solitude. The listing showed a well-maintained cabin with a wood stove, propane heat, a comfortable writing desk positioned by a large window overlooking the forest, and a small library of books left by previous guests. The owner, a woman named Patricia Hayes, had excellent reviews from other writers who had stayed there. The price was reasonable at $80 per night, and the place looked perfect for what I needed. I arrived on November 8th, driving my Subaru Outback loaded with 2 weeks' worth of food, my laptop, notebooks, research materials, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Single story, maybe 700 square feet, with a main room containing the kitchen and writing area, a separate bedroom, and a bathroom with a shower that ran off a propane water heater. The writing desk was positioned perfectly, facing a large window with a view of dense spruce forest and a small creek about 50 yards away. Patricia had left detailed instructions about the propane systems, the wood stove operation, and emergency contacts in case something went wrong. She mentioned that the previous guest had checked out just 2 days earlier, another writer working on a memoir, and that the cabin had been cleaned and restocked with firewood. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I settled into a comfortable routine. Wake at 7 a.m., make coffee, write until noon, take a break for lunch and a walk in the woods, write again from 2 hours until 6 hours, make dinner, read by the fire until 10, hooray, then sleep. The isolation was perfect. No phone calls, no emails, no social media, just me and my manuscript. The novel was coming together better than I had hoped, and by the end of day 3, I had written over 15,000 words. On the evening of November 11th, while making dinner, I noticed a journal on the small bookshelf in the corner. It was one of those leather-bound notebooks, about 200 pages, with an elastic band holding it closed. I assumed it was part of the cabin's library and pulled it out to look at it. The first page had a name written in neat handwriting, Rachel Torres, and a date, November 2021, exactly 1 year earlier. I flipped through the pages and realized it was a daily writing journal, the kind writers keep to track their progress and reflect on their work. Rachel had been staying at this exact cabin, working on a book documenting her days. I should have put it back. It felt invasive to read someone else's private journal. But I was curious, and I started reading the first entry. Rachel described arriving at the cabin, how peaceful it was, how she had the same routine as mine. Wake at 7, coffee, writing until noon, walk in the woods, more writing, dinner, reading by the fire. The details were remarkably similar. Same desk, same window view, same sense of isolation and productivity. I read a few more entries. Day 2, day 3, day 4. Her routine never varied. And then I got to day 5, November 13th, 2021, and something in her entry made my hands go cold. She wrote that she had found a journal in the cabin, left by a previous guest. A woman named Jennifer Malik, who had stayed there exactly 1 year before Rachel, in November 2020. Jennifer had kept a detailed daily log of her writing retreat, and according to Rachel's journal, Jennifer's routine had been identical to Rachel's. Same wake time, same writing schedule, same walks, same evening reading. Rachel wrote that it felt eerie, like she was following a script she had not written, but she dismissed it as coincidence. Writers are creatures of habit, she reasoned. Of course, multiple people would develop similar routines in the same space. I kept reading. Rachel's entries for the next few days showed increasing unease. She mentioned that her own routine had started to feel automatic, like she was not choosing her actions, but simply performing them. She tried to break the pattern by staying up later, by skipping her afternoon walk, but found herself unable to. Her body moved through the routine regardless of what her mind wanted. On day 7, November 15th, Rachel wrote something that made me close the journal and sit there staring at the wall. She had continued reading Jennifer's journal and discovered that Jennifer had described her death. In the final entry, dated November 16th, 2020, Jennifer wrote that the cabin's heater would malfunction that evening, that a propane leak would cause a fire, and that she would die in her sleep from smoke inhalation. Jennifer wrote it matter-of-factly, like she was describing something that had already happened, not something that was going to happen. And then Rachel wrote that she had searched online for Jennifer Malik and found an obituary. Jennifer Malik, age 34, author, died November 16th, 2020, in a cabin fire on the Kenai Peninsula. Cause of death was smoke inhalation due to a faulty propane heater. I sat there with that journal in my hands, my dinner going cold on the stove, trying to process what I had just read. Rachel had stayed in this cabin knowing that the previous guest had died here, knowing that Jennifer had somehow predicted her own death in her journal, and Rachel had kept writing her own entries. I flipped to the last pages of Rachel's journal, my hands shaking. The final entry was dated November 15th, 2021, exactly 1 year ago to this day. Rachel wrote that she understood now how it worked. The cabin did not just inspire writing, it demanded a specific story. And that story always ended the same way. She wrote that she had tried to leave that morning, but found her car would not start. She had tried to hike out, but found herself walking in circles, always ending up back at the cabin. She wrote that she would die tomorrow, November 16th, just like Jennifer, and that whoever came next would find her journal, would read it, would follow the same routine, and would die on their own November 16th. I dropped the journal and ran to my laptop, searched for Rachel Torres, found her obituary immediately. Rachel Torres, age 31, novelist, died November 16th, 2021, in an accidental cabin fire. I looked at the date on my phone, November 11th, 2022. 5 days until November 16th. 5 days until my date. I grabbed my car keys and my coat and ran outside. My Subaru was parked right where I had left it. I got in, turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing. Dead battery. Impossible. The car was only 3 years old and had been running perfectly when I arrived. I tried again. Nothing. I got out and opened the hood. The battery cables had been disconnected, not corroded, not loose, deliberately removed and set aside on the engine block. I walked back into the cabin and looked at that journal sitting on the table. I picked it up and flipped to the middle pages, looking for any mention of how to break the pattern, any indication that someone had escaped. But every entry in Rachel's journal suggested there was no escape. The routine would continue. The date would arrive. The death would happen. I refused to accept that. I had 5 days to figure this out. I spent the next hour searching the cabin systematically, looking for more journals, more evidence, anything that might explain what was happening. In a storage box under the bed, I found them. 4 more journals, 4 more women, 4 more November 16th deaths, going back to 2017. Each one had documented the same routine, the same growing sense of inevitability, the same realization that the cabin was not just a place but a trap. The oldest journal, from 2017, belonged to a woman named Amanda Cross. Her entries were the most detailed. She had researched the cabin's history and discovered it had been built in 1987 by a writer named Eleanor Vance, who had come to Alaska to work on her final novel. Eleanor had died in the cabin on November 16, 1987, of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater. Amanda theorized that something about Eleanor's death had imprinted on the location, creating a loop that demanded repetition. Every woman who stayed there seeking creative isolation became part of the pattern. Amanda had tried everything to escape. She had smashed the windows, broken down the door, hiked into the forest. But her final entry, written on November 15, 2017, said that none of it mattered. The cabin would have its story. The date would come. The pattern would complete. I decided that if I could not leave, I would change the pattern. On November 12th, I stayed awake all night. Did not sleep, did not follow the routine. On November 13th, I disabled the propane heater completely, shut off the valve at the tank outside, disconnected the lines. If the death was supposed to happen via heater malfunction, I would remove the heater from the equation. On November 14th, I smashed my own laptop so I could not write, burned the journals in the wood stove so no one else would find them. I was not going to be part of this pattern. On November 15th, I sat by the window with every light in the cabin on, watching the forest, waiting for November 16th. That was when I saw Patricia Hayes, the cabin owner, walking up the path toward the cabin. She knocked on the door. I did not answer. She knocked again and called my name. Said she needed to check the propane system. Said there had been recalls on the heater model, that it was dangerous, that she needed to replace it. I opened the door. Told her I had already disconnected it. Told her I knew what happened here. Told her about the journals, the deaths, the pattern. Patricia looked at me with this sad, tired expression and said I did not understand. Said the cabin was not cursed. Said there was no supernatural pattern. She pulled out her phone and showed me something. Police reports, arrest warrants. Patricia Hayes was not the cabin owner. Patricia Hayes was a serial arsonist with a history of targeting remote rental properties. She had been deliberately sabotaging the heaters, causing the fires, killing the women who stayed there. Insurance fraud, she called it. Multiple payouts over 5 years. She had been careful, spacing the deaths out annually, always on November 16th, to make it seem like some kind of supernatural coincidence. And the journals were hers. She had written all of them in different handwriting, creating a false history to make any survivor believe they were trapped by something beyond human control. I ran. Straight past her, into the forest, not caring about direction, just moving. I heard her behind me, heard her calling, heard the sound of liquid splashing on wood. When I looked back, the cabin was already burning. Patricia had doused it in accelerant while I ran. I kept moving, found the creek, followed it downhill for 3 miles until I reached a logging road, flagged down a truck, made it to the state police. They found Patricia 2 days later trying to burn down another cabin with another woman inside. She is in prison now, awaiting trial for 6 counts of murder. The journals were all fakes. The pattern was all her. And I am alive because I figured it out one day before. She planned to kill me, but I do not write in remote cabins anymore. I do not trust isolation, and I never want to see another journal again. I work as a hunting guide in Alaska. Have been doing it for about 8 years now, taking clients out into remote areas for caribou, moose, bear, whatever they have a tag for. Most of my clients are experienced outdoorsmen who understand the risks and respect the wilderness, but occasionally I get someone who booked the trip for the Instagram photos and has no real understanding of what it means to be 100 miles from the nearest road in September, when the weather can turn deadly in an hour. In September 2019, I took a client named Marcus Reynolds out to the Wrangell Mountains for a 3-day moose hunt. Marcus was a 42-year-old attorney from Seattle who had hunted whitetail deer in Pennsylvania, but never done anything like an Alaskan backcountry hunt. He seemed physically fit, had decent gear, and had paid the full $8,500 fee up front. So I figured he would be fine. We flew into a remote drainage on September 18th in a Super Cub on floats, landing on a small lake about 6 miles from a hunting cabin I had used many times before. The cabin was basic but solid, built by the Bureau of Land Management back in the 1970s as an emergency shelter for pilots and hunters. It had 4 walls, a metal roof, a wood stove, and 2 wooden bunks with foam mattresses that smelled like mildew. No windows, just a door, and some gaps in the log walls where the chinking had fallen out. The location was perfect though, right in the middle of prime moose habitat, with several game trails converging near a willow-choked creek bottom. I had taken 5 clients to this exact cabin over the previous 3 years, and we had a 100% success rate. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days glassing the surrounding valleys, locate a legal bull, make the shot, process the meat, and pack it back to the lake for pickup on September 21st. The first day went fine. We hiked about 4 miles from the cabin, spotted several cows and a small bull, and got a feel for the terrain. Marcus was moving slower than I would have liked, complaining about the weight of his pack and the density of the brush. But that was normal for first-timers. That evening back at the cabin, while I was cooking freeze-dried stew on my camp stove, Marcus mentioned that he felt like we were being watched. I told him that was a normal reaction to being in grizzly country, that your subconscious picks up on subtle cues and makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. He insisted it was more than that, said he had felt eyes on him all afternoon while we were glassing, like something was tracking us from the tree line. I checked the area around the cabin with my headlamp before we turned in, looking for tracks or scat, but there was nothing unusual, just the standard mosaic of game trails, old bear sign from earlier in the season, and the usual bird activity. We went to sleep around 10 p.m., and I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of Marcus moving around in his bunk. He was sitting up staring at the door, his headlamp on. I asked what was wrong, and he said he heard something outside. Footsteps, circling the cabin. I listened for a solid 5 minutes but heard nothing except wind in the spruce trees and the distant sound of the creek. The next morning, September 19th, I found tracks outside the cabin that had not been there the night before. Human tracks, barefoot. That alone was disturbing enough because nobody goes barefoot in the Alaskan backcountry. The ground is rough, cold, and full of things that will cut you or infect you. But these tracks were weird in other ways too. They were too long, maybe 14 inches from heel to toe, and the stride length between prints was excessive, about 6 feet. The tracks circled the entire cabin, coming within 3 feet of the door, then disappeared into the forest heading north. I took photos with my phone, more for documentation than anything else, because I could not explain what I was seeing. Marcus saw the tracks and immediately wanted to leave, said we should hike back to the lake and call for an early pickup. I told him we had 2 more days on the hunt and that whatever made those tracks was gone. He reluctantly agreed to continue, but I could tell he was rattled. We headed out around 8 a.m. hiking west toward a ridgeline that offered good visibility into multiple valleys. Marcus was jumpy the entire morning, constantly looking over his shoulder, asking if I heard things that I definitely did not hear. Around noon, we stopped for lunch on an exposed knob with 360-degree views. While we were eating, Marcus pointed to the tree line about 400 yards below us, said something was standing there, watching us. I glassed the area with my binoculars for a solid minute but saw nothing. Just trees and brush and the natural play of light and shadow, Marcus insisted. Said there was a figure, tall and dark, standing just inside the tree line. I handed him the binoculars and he looked through them, then handed them back and said it was gone. I suggested we head back to camp early, thinking maybe he was experiencing altitude sickness or dehydration or just the general stress of being in an unfamiliar environment. On the hike back, Marcus kept stopping every few hundred yards, turning around, checking behind us. Each time I asked what was wrong, he said the same thing. Something was following us. Something was keeping pace in the trees just out of sight. I never saw or heard anything, but I started paying more attention. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed something that made my gut tighten. There were tracks on the trail we had used that morning, the same barefoot tracks from outside the cabin, but these were fresh, pressed into soft mud that had not been there when we passed through 6 hours earlier. And the tracks were following our boot prints exactly, like whatever made them had been walking our trail while we were out. The stride length matched our pace. Where we had stepped over a log, the tracks went over the same log. Where we had skirted around a mud hole, the tracks did the same. It was deliberate, intentional, like something was studying how we moved. We got back to the cabin around 4 p.m. and I immediately checked the interior. Nothing had been disturbed. Our gear was exactly where we left it. Food cache was untouched, everything normal. I started a fire in the wood stove and made coffee, while Marcus sat on his bunk staring at the door. He asked if I believed him now, if I could see that something was wrong. I told him honestly that I did not know what to make of the tracks, but that we would stay alert and keep our bear spray and rifles close. That night, neither of us slept much. We took turns staying awake, listening. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time I heard them too, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin, heavy enough to make the floorboards creak slightly when they passed close to the walls. I grabbed my rifle and my spotlight and went to the door, told Marcus to cover me. I yanked the door open and hit the area with 1,000 lumens of LED light. Nothing, just darkness and trees and the sound of my own breathing. But when I stepped outside and looked at the ground, the tracks were there, fresh, wet, leading away from the cabin toward the lake. I followed them for maybe 50 yards with my light, and they just kept going, straight and purposeful, never deviating. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Marcus screaming from inside the cabin. I ran back and found him pressed against the far wall, his rifle aimed at the door, shaking. He said while I was outside following the tracks, something had knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks from the inside. I looked at the door. We were both inside now. There was no one else. But as I stood there, I saw something that confirmed what Marcus was saying. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the door to the center of the cabin, then stopping. Barefoot prints, 14 inches long. Inside a locked cabin, I made a decision. We were leaving, right then, in the dark. I did not care about the hunt, or the money, or finishing the contract. I grabbed our essential gear, our rifles, and our headlamps, and we started hiking toward the lake. It was 1:10 a.m., pitch black, and we were moving through dense forest with only our headlamps for light. Terrible decision from a safety standpoint, but staying in that cabin felt worse. We made it maybe a mile before Marcus stopped walking, just stopped in the middle of the trail and stood there, his headlamp pointing at the ground. I asked what was wrong. He did not respond. I walked back to him, grabbed his shoulder, shook him. He looked at me with this blank expression and said something I will never forget. He said, "It told me to wait here." I tried to get him moving again, but he would not budge. He just stood there in the middle of the trail, rifle hanging loose in his hands, staring at nothing. I was bigger than him, stronger, and I considered just dragging him. But then I heard it. A voice, coming from somewhere in the trees ahead of us. It was calling Marcus's name, over and over, not shouting, just speaking in a normal conversational tone, but somehow carrying through the forest clearly. I shined my light toward the sound, but saw nothing. The voice kept calling. Marcus started walking toward it. I grabbed him, physically held him back, and he fought me. Fought harder than he should have been able to, with this desperate strength that felt wrong. We struggled for maybe 30 seconds before he suddenly went limp, collapsing in my arms, unconscious. I carried him, threw him over my shoulders in a fireman's carry, and started moving as fast as I could toward the lake. He weighed maybe 180 pounds plus his gear, and I am not a small guy, but that was the hardest mile I have ever hiked. Every few minutes, I would hear that voice, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always calling Marcus's name. I did not stop, did not look back, just kept moving. When I finally reached the lake around 4 a.m., I laid Marcus down on the shore and activated my emergency beacon. Then I sat there with my rifle across my lap, watching the tree line, waiting for dawn. Marcus woke up about an hour later with no memory of the previous 6 hours. He did not remember stopping on the trail, did not remember hearing the voice, did not remember fighting me. His last clear memory was being in the cabin and hearing the knocking. The helicopter arrived at 7:30 a.m. The pilot took one look at us and did not ask questions, just got us loaded and airborne. I filed a report with the state wildlife troopers about the incident, showed them the photos of the tracks, and told them everything that happened. They sent a team out to investigate the cabin 2 days later, found nothing unusual, no tracks, no evidence of any other person in the area. But they did find Marcus's boot prints leading from the cabin into the forest, going north for about 8 miles before disappearing into a frozen creek bed. Problem is, Marcus was with me the entire time. His boots were on his feet when we hiked to the lake. Whatever left those prints in his boot pattern was not him. I quit guiding after that, moved to Anchorage, got a job working dispatch for a logistics company. Marcus suffered severe PTSD from the experience. He called me about 6 months later and said he still heard that voice sometimes, late at night, calling his name, telling him to come back. I do not go into the Wrangells anymore. I do not stay in remote cabins, and I do not ever want to see those barefoot tracks again. I work as a park ranger for the Chugach National Forest. I've been doing it for about 14 years now, mostly backcountry patrol and wilderness management in some of the most remote sections of south central Alaska. The job involves a lot of solo work, checking on cabins and trails, documenting wildlife, making sure the Forest Service infrastructure is maintained and safe for the few people who ventured this far out. In February 2021, I was assigned to conduct winter cabin inspections along a 10-day route that covered 14 remote public-use cabins scattered across about 120 square miles of forest. The route was standard for winter inspections. Snowmobile from cabin to cabin, check for structural damage, verify that emergency supplies were stocked, document any wildlife activity or hazards, and file reports for each location. I had done the same route 3 times before, and nothing about this trip seemed any different when I loaded my sled on February 8th and headed out from the ranger station. The first 6 cabins went exactly as expected. Minor maintenance issues, a broken window at cabin 3 that I boarded up temporarily, some mouse damage at cabin 5, standard winter conditions. I was making good time, staying on schedule, and the weather was cooperating with clear skies and temperatures hovering around 20 degrees. On February 12th, I reached cabin 7, a small structure about 35 miles northeast of the nearest road access, situated in a valley surrounded by dense spruce forest. The cabin was one of the older ones in the system, built in 1968, maybe 400 square feet, with a wood stove, 2 bunks, and basic emergency supplies. According to my records, the last official use was in November 2020, nearly 3 months earlier. The reservation system showed no bookings for the winter season, which was normal because this particular cabin was difficult to access, and only experienced backcountry users typically reserved it. When I pulled up on my snowmobile around 2 p.m., the first thing I noticed was smoke coming from the chimney. Thin, barely visible, but definitely smoke. That immediately raised questions because there should not have been anyone there. I parked the sled and approached the cabin cautiously, looking for other snowmobile tracks or ski trails that would indicate how someone had accessed the location. There were none, just my own tracks from the approach and the pristine snow that had fallen 2 days earlier, covering everything within a 3-mile radius. The cabin door was closed, but not locked. Forest Service cabins do not have locks because they serve as emergency shelters for anyone who needs them. I called out, announcing myself as a ranger, asking if anyone was inside. No response. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was warm. The wood stove was burning with a good fire, fresh wood recently added based on the lack of ash buildup. On the small table in the center of the room were 2 tin cups, both containing what looked like coffee, steam rising from the liquid. The bunks had sleeping bags laid out on them, unzipped and arranged like someone had just gotten up. There were boots by the door, 2 pairs, both dry and clean, like they had been placed there recently. The entire scene looked like 2 people had been occupying the cabin within the last hour and had simply stepped outside briefly. Except there was no one outside. I had circled the cabin looking for tracks. There were none, and the coffee in those cups was hot, actively steaming. I touched one of the cups and pulled my hand back immediately because the metal was too hot to hold. I keyed my radio and tried to reach dispatch, but I was too far out. The terrain in that valley blocked most radio signals, and I would need to get to higher ground to make contact. I pulled out my satellite phone and considered calling it in. But what would I report? That someone had made coffee and left, that boots were by the door. Nothing about the situation was technically an emergency. It was just wrong. The cabin was occupied, or had been very recently occupied, but there was no physical evidence of how anyone had gotten there or where they had gone. I decided to wait. I sat in the single chair by the table watching those 2 cups of coffee slowly stop steaming, and I waited for whoever had made them to return. An hour passed. The fire in the wood stove started to die down, so I added more wood from the stack inside. The coffee in the cups was now room temperature. The boots had not moved. Nothing had changed except the passage of time. At 4 p.m., with daylight starting to fade, I made the decision to set up my body camera. Rangers carry them for documentation and safety, and something about this situation felt like it needed to be recorded. I mounted the camera on my chest harness, activated it, and started documenting everything I was seeing. The warm stove, the coffee cups, the boots, the sleeping bags, the complete absence of any tracks leading to or from the cabin. I narrated everything for the recording, keeping my voice steady and professional, even though my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. That is when I noticed the window. There was condensation on the inside of the glass, which made sense given the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cold outside. But in that condensation, someone had drawn 2 handprints. Small, like a child's hands, pressed against the window from the inside, fresh enough that the prints were still clearly defined, water droplets running down from where the fingers had pressed. I moved to the window and looked at those handprints. They were maybe 18 inches off the floor, low enough that someone would have had to crouch or kneel to make them. I looked around the single room again. There was nowhere for a child to hide. Nowhere for anyone to hide. The cabin was 20 feet by 20 feet, with no closets, no loft, no crawl space. I was alone. I pulled out my thermal scanner, a handheld device we use to check for heat signatures in buildings, and I scanned the entire interior. 1 heat signature, mine, nothing else registering as warm-blooded or recently alive. But those handprints were there, and as I watched, more appeared. Slowly, like invisible fingers were pressing against the glass right in front of me. 5 prints total, spread across the window at various heights, all appearing within a 30-second span while I stood there recording everything. I backed away from the window and moved toward the door, keeping my eyes on the interior of the cabin. That is when I heard it. Voices. 2 distinct voices having a conversation, speaking in normal tones like they were having a casual discussion. The voices were coming from inside the cabin. One voice was male, deeper, talking about needing to set the table. The other voice was female, lighter, responding that they needed to pour the coffee. I could hear them clearly, could understand every word, but I could not see anyone. My thermal scanner still showed only my heat signature. My body camera was recording everything. I stood there, frozen, as I heard the sound of liquid being poured, the clink of metal cups being set down on the wooden table. I watched as the 2 cups that had been sitting on the table for 2 hours slowly filled with fresh coffee. The liquid appeared in the cups like it was being poured from an invisible pot, rising from the bottom of each cup until they were about 3/4 full, then stopping. The male voice said something about the weather, about how cold it had gotten, about how they needed to stay warm. The female voice agreed, mentioning that they had plenty of wood, that the fire would keep them comfortable through the night. The conversation was completely mundane, the kind of small talk you would hear from any 2 people staying in a remote cabin. Except there was no one there. I could hear them. I could see the evidence of their presence. But my eyes, my thermal scanner, and every logical part of my brain told me I was completely alone. I activated my radio, even knowing it would not reach anyone, and started broadcasting. Ranger Benson, Cabin 7, requesting backup. I do not know what I am experiencing, but I need another ranger to verify. Then the female voice said my name. Said Clara needs to understand. Said I should not be here, that this cabin was occupied, that I needed to leave them alone. I grabbed my pack and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, the door swung open by itself, not violently, just a smooth opening like someone had pulled it from the outside. I stepped through, and the door closed behind me with a soft click. I went straight to my snowmobile, started the engine, and called dispatch on my satellite phone. Told them I was evacuating Cabin 7, that there was an unexplained situation, and that I needed another ranger to meet me at Cabin 8, 12 miles north. Dispatch asked if I was in danger. I told them honestly that I did not know, but that I was leaving immediately. I rode to Cabin 8 in the fading light, arrived around 5:30 p.m., and waited inside with all my lights on and my radio active until backup arrived the next morning. Ranger Mitchell arrived at 9 user a.m. on February 13th. We rode back to Cabin 7 together, arriving around 11 Olcart. The cabin was freezing cold when we entered. The wood stove was completely cold, No recent fire, just old ash from what looked like weeks or months ago. The table was bare. No coffee cups. No sleeping bags on the bunks. No boots by the door. The window had no handprints, no condensation, nothing. Mitchell looked at me like I had lost my mind. I showed him my body camera footage. He watched the entire 47-minute recording, watched me document the warm cabin, the steaming coffee, the handprints appearing on the window, the cups filling with fresh coffee. Heard the voices clearly on the audio. He played it back 3 times. Then he sent it to the Forest Service regional office. The investigation took 2 weeks. Audio specialists analyzed the recording. They confirmed 2 distinct voices, one male, one female, having a conversation in English. They confirmed the sound of liquid being poured. They confirmed my voice narrating everything. The thermal imaging data from my scanner was reviewed. It showed only my heat signature, exactly as I had seen. The video footage was examined for tampering or editing. None was found. The regional supervisor drove out to Cabin 7 with a team in March. They found records showing the cabin had been the site of a double fatality in 1987. A married couple, Edward and Marion Hartley, had died of carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning wood stove. They were found 3 days after their deaths, sitting at the table with coffee cups in front of them. The final entry in their cabin log mentioned making coffee, discussing the weather, and planning to stay warm through a cold snap. The Forest Service permanently closed Cabin 7. They removed it from the reservation system, posted it as unsafe for occupancy, and eventually had it locked with chains and warning signs. I requested reassignment to the visitor center in Seward. I still work for the Forest Service, still love the job, but I do not do solo cabin inspections anymore. And I will never forget standing in that cabin, watching invisible hands pour coffee into empty cups, while voices discussed the weather like it was the most natural thing in the world. I work as an oil pipeline inspector for one of the major energy companies operating on the North Slope of Alaska. Have been doing it for about 18 years now, monitoring the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System and various feeder lines that connect remote drilling operations to the main infrastructure. The job involves rotating shifts at maintenance stations, most of them in areas where winter temperatures regularly hit 40 below zero and summer means the sun never sets. In January 2020, I was assigned to a 2-week rotation at a maintenance cabin near Prudhoe Bay, about 8 miles from the nearest major facility. The cabin housed rotating crews of 3 inspectors who monitored a specific 50-mile section of pipeline, checking pressure readings, inspecting for leaks, and maintaining access roads. The setup was standard. 3 bedrooms, a common area with kitchen and workstation, a generator room, and all the communications equipment we needed to stay in contact with the main operations center. When I arrived on January 6th via company helicopter, I was joining 2 other inspectors already on site. Rick Paulson, a 52-year-old veteran who had been working the slope for 30 years, and James Chen, a 29-year-old engineer who was relatively new to Alaska but had solid credentials from working pipelines in Wyoming. The handoff from the outgoing crew was routine. They briefed us on the current status of the pipeline section, mentioned a minor pressure fluctuation at mile marker 47 that needed monitoring, and warned us that a cold snap was coming with temperatures expected to drop to 50 below by the end of the week. They also mentioned something that I initially dismissed as a joke. They said the 4th bedroom door had been locked from the inside since 2015, and that the company had never bothered to break it down, because it was not worth the expense to replace the door just to access an unused room. The cabin had been built in 1981, expanded in 1995, with the addition of a 4th bedroom to accommodate larger crews during major maintenance projects. But according to Rick, who had been working out of this cabin on and off since 2003, that 4th bedroom had always been problematic. He said different crews had reported hearing noises from inside it, that some workers refused to sleep in the adjacent bedroom because of sounds coming through the wall, and that in 2015, during a particularly harsh winter, one of the inspectors had locked himself inside and refused to come out. When the company finally got someone to check on him 3 days later, they found the worker dead from what the medical examiner ruled as cardiac arrest, natural causes, stress, and isolation. But the door had been locked from the inside with the security latch engaged, and after they removed the body, no one could find the key to unlock it properly. The company decided it was easier to just leave it locked and use the other 3 bedrooms for crew rotations. I looked at the door that first evening while Rick was telling me the history. It was just a standard interior door, solid wood, painted white, with a simple handle and a security latch. The kind of latch you would see in any cabin or hotel room, just a small metal arm that swings down to prevent the door from being opened from the outside. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, maybe half an inch of clearance, I could see darkness. No light, no movement, just an empty room that had been closed off for 5 years. James asked if anyone had tried to force the door open, and Rick said the company maintenance team had looked at it twice, but decided it would require damaging the door frame, which would then require flying in materials to repair it, which was not cost-effective for a room they did not need, so it stayed locked. The 3 of us settled into our routine. Rick took the first bedroom, James took the second, and I took the third, which was directly adjacent to the locked 4th bedroom. The first 3 days were unremarkable. We ran our pipeline checks, monitored the pressure readings, submitted our reports, and dealt with the extreme cold that made every outdoor task feel like a battle against the environment. At night, we would cook dinner together, play cards, read, and turn in around 10 p.m. I slept fine the first 2 nights. On the 3rd night, January 9th, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. to a sound coming from the other side of the wall, a rhythmic banging, not loud but distinct. Bang, pause, bang, pause, bang. It was coming from inside the locked bedroom. I laid there, listening for maybe 5 minutes, trying to convince myself it was the building settling or the wind or the heating system, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. I got up and went to the common area where Rick was sitting at the workstation doing some late-night data entry. I asked if he heard the banging. He said no, that the cabin was quiet, that maybe I was hearing the generator cycling. I went back to bed, and the sound had stopped. The next night, same thing. Woke up at 2:17 a.m. to the same rhythmic banging from the locked room. This time I got up immediately and went to the door, put my ear against it and listened. The banging was definitely coming from inside, and it seemed to be synchronized with something. I stood there, trying to figure out what, and then I realized it was matching my heartbeat. Every time my heart beat, the banging happened. I stepped back from the door, and the banging stopped immediately. I moved close again, and it resumed, perfectly timed with my pulse. I woke up Rick and James, brought them both to the door, and asked if they could hear it. They both said no. James put his ear to the door for a solid minute and said he heard nothing, but I could hear it clearly. Bang, 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 matching my heartbeat exactly. Rick suggested I switch bedrooms with him, that maybe the wall was thin enough that I was hearing my own pulse amplified through the structure. I took his room for the next 2 nights and slept fine. No banging, no sounds. On January 13th, Rick mentioned casually over breakfast that he had heard something the previous night. Rhythmic banging from the locked room, perfectly timed with his heartbeat. He laughed it off, said it was probably just his imagination after I'd mentioned it, but I could see it bothered him. That night, I was back in my original bedroom, and at 2:17 a.m., the banging started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, and between the bangs, I heard something else, a voice, very faint, coming from inside the locked room, saying something I could not quite make out. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and went to the door. Knelt down and looked through the gap at the bottom. I could see the floor of the room, bare wood boards, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A journal. Lying open on the floor, right inside the door, close enough that I could almost reach it if I laid flat and stretched my arm through the gap. The journal had not been there before. I was certain of that. I had looked under the door multiple times over the past week and seen nothing but empty floor. I went to the storage closet and found a wire coat hanger, straightened it out and used it to drag the journal close enough to pull it through the gap under the door. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, and when I opened it, I saw handwriting, dated entries. The first one was from January 2015. The journal belonged to Kenneth Morrison, the inspector who had died in that room. His entries documented his 2-week rotation at the cabin, starting normal enough with routine pipeline reports and observations about the weather. But around day 5, the entries changed. Kenneth wrote about hearing banging in the night, about how the sound matched his heartbeat, about how it seemed to speed up when he was stressed and slow down when he was calm. He wrote that he had tried to ignore it, but the sound was driving him into a constant state of anxiety. His resting heart rate had increased from 65 beats per minute to over 90. He was not sleeping, was not eating properly. On January 14, 2015, Kenneth wrote something that made my hands shake. He wrote that something in the cabin was listening to heartbeats, that it was waiting for the right rhythm, that when a heart beat in a specific pattern, matching some frequency it recognized, it would take that person. Kenneth's final entry was dated January 15, 2015. He wrote that his heart rate had been climbing all day, that he could feel it racing in his chest, that the banging in the room was constant now, so loud he could barely think. He wrote that he needed to isolate himself, to lock himself somewhere quiet until his heart rate stabilized. The entry ended mid-sentence. The medical examiner had found him dead from cardiac arrest 36 hours later. I sat there in the common area at 3 a.m., reading this journal, feeling my own heart pounding harder than it should be. I woke up Rick and James and showed them what I had found. James suggested we break down the door immediately, that whatever was in that room needed to be dealt with. Rick was more cautious, said we should call the company first, get authorization. I made the decision without waiting for consensus. I went to the locked door with a pry bar from the maintenance kit and forced it open. The latch broke easily, the door swung inward, and we all looked inside. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with a single bunk bed and a small desk. On the floor, exactly where the journal had been, was Kenneth Morrison, or what was left of him. The company had removed his body in 2015. I had seen the death certificate, but there he was, or something that looked exactly like the photos I had seen in the incident report. Lying on the floor, eyes open, one hand clutching his chest. We all stood there, frozen. Then the body blinked. Not a natural blink, but a slow, deliberate closing and opening of the eyes. James screamed and backed out of the room. Rick grabbed me and pulled me away from the door. We slammed it shut and pushed a heavy desk against it. We called for emergency evacuation at 3:30 a.m. The helicopter arrived at first light January 14th and got us out of there. The company sent a team to investigate the cabin 2 days later. They found the 4th bedroom exactly as it had been. Empty. No body. No evidence of Kenneth Morrison ever being there after his removal in 2015. But they did find something. Under the floorboards in that room, they found remains. Partial skeleton, decades old, identified through dental records as belonging to Daniel Kruger, a pipeline worker who had disappeared in 1983. His death had never been solved. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest based on the skeletal evidence. The company closed the cabin permanently, demolished it 3 months later. I took early retirement with full pension. Rick transferred to desk work in Anchorage. James quit the industry entirely. And I have never been able to forget seeing Kenneth Morrison's body lying on that floor, 5 years after his death, blinking at us like he was still waiting for something, still listening to heartbeats, still looking for the right rhythm. I am a graduate student working on my doctorate in climate science at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Have been studying Arctic climate patterns for about 5 years now. focusing on permafrost degradation and its impact on carbon release. In December 2023, I was assigned a month-long data collection project at a university research cabin near Juneau, about 45 miles from the nearest town. The cabin was equipped with sensors placed throughout the surrounding forest to monitor temperature fluctuations, soil conditions, seismic activity, and electromagnetic readings. My job was straightforward: stay at the cabin, maintain the sensor network, download data daily, and compile preliminary reports. The isolation did not bother me. I had done similar assignments before, and I actually preferred working alone without the distractions of campus life. I arrived at the cabin on December 3rd via helicopter, carrying a month's worth of supplies, my laptop, research equipment, and enough freeze-dried meals to feed a small expedition. The cabin was well maintained, maybe 600 square feet with a propane heater, a small kitchen, a work desk with satellite internet, and a bedroom with a comfortable bunk. The university had invested in decent infrastructure for their remote research sites, and this one was considered one of the better locations. I spent the first 2 days familiarizing myself with the sensor network, checking calibrations, and establishing my daily routine. The data collection window ran from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., with automated systems handling overnight readings. Everything was working perfectly. The temperatures were cold, averaging around 15 degrees during the day and dropping to near 0 at night, but that was expected for December in southeast Alaska. On December 6th, my 4th day at the cabin, I noticed something unusual in the overnight data. At exactly 3:33 a.m., every sensor in the network had recorded simultaneous anomalies, temperature spikes of 15 to 20 degrees lasting for approximately 18 minutes, electromagnetic interference strong enough to corrupt some of the data files, and minor seismic tremors registering 1.2 on the Richter scale. I checked the equipment, thinking maybe there had been a power surge or a calibration error, but everything appeared normal. The sensors were functioning correctly, the data logs were intact, and there was no indication of malfunction. I filed a note in my daily report and continued monitoring. The next night, December 7th, the same thing happened. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the sensors recorded identical anomalies: temperature spikes, electromagnetic interference, seismic activity, all lasting 18 minutes before returning to normal baseline readings. I stayed awake on December 8th, determined to observe whatever was causing these readings in real time. I set my alarm for 3:15 a.m., made coffee, and positioned myself at the work desk with my laptop open, monitoring the live sensor feeds. At 3:33 a.m., the readings started spiking exactly as the logs had shown, but I felt nothing. The cabin temperature remained constant. I heard no unusual sounds, felt no vibrations, saw no lights or electromagnetic disturbances. Yet the sensors, positioned at distances ranging from 100 yards to half a mile from the cabin, were all registering these massive environmental changes. I grabbed my thermal camera and went outside, scanning the forest in every direction. The thermal imaging showed normal cold temperatures everywhere. No hotspots, no anomalies, but the sensors continued recording their spikes for exactly 18 minutes before everything returned to normal at 3:51 a.m. That morning, I reviewed all the data carefully and noticed something I had missed before. I had external security cameras positioned around the cabin, mainly for wildlife documentation. I pulled up the footage from 3:33 a.m. and watched myself on screen. I saw myself leave the cabin at 3:33 a.m., walk approximately 50 yards into the forest, stand motionless for 18 minutes, then walk back to the cabin and re-enter at 3:51 a.m. I watched this footage 3 times. I had no memory of leaving the cabin. None. I remembered sitting at my desk, monitoring the live feeds, going outside briefly with the thermal camera after the reading started, then coming back inside. But the timestamp on my thermal camera use showed 3:55 a.m., 4 minutes after I had already returned to the cabin according to the security footage. The footage clearly showed me exiting the cabin at 3:33 a.m. before the anomalies started, and standing in the forest during the entire 18-minute window. I checked my clothing. My boots were by the door, dry and clean, no evidence of having been outside in the snow. My coat was hanging on its hook, not cold or damp. But the security camera footage was undeniable. I'd been outside. I'd walked into the forest and stood there for 18 minutes in 5-degree weather wearing only the clothes I had on in the cabin. No coat, no boots, no gloves. And I had no memory of any of it. I spent the rest of that day trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had experienced some kind of sleepwalking episode. Maybe the stress of isolation was affecting me more than I realized. I called my faculty advisor on the satellite phone and mentioned that I was having some unusual experiences, but I downplayed the severity because I did not want to sound unstable or unreliable. He suggested I take better notes about my sleep patterns and consider ending the assignment early if I felt it was affecting my health. That night, December 9th, I made a decision. I was not going to let myself leave the cabin during the 3:33 a.m. window. I positioned my desk chair in front of the door, set up my laptop to record me continuously, and I used zip ties to secure my wrists to the chair arms, loose enough that I could break free if there was an emergency, but tight enough that I would definitely wake up if I tried to remove them while unconscious. I set my alarm for 3:15 a.m. and forced myself to stay awake. At 3:30 a.m., I activated the laptop camera and the zip ties. At 3:33 a.m., I felt it. This overwhelming compulsion to stand up and walk to the door. Not a physical force, but a mental pressure. Like every fiber of my being was screaming at me to go outside. I gripped the chair arms and focused on staying seated. The zip ties cut into my wrists as I unconsciously pulled against them. My legs were moving, trying to push me upright, but the restraints held. Then I heard it. A voice outside the cabin, calling my name. The voice sounded exactly like my sister. My sister Emma, who died in a car accident in 2019. She was calling me, saying, "Lucy, come outside," saying she needed to show me something, saying it was important. I knew it was not real. I knew Emma was dead. But the voice was perfect. The tone, the inflection, the way she used to say my name when we were kids. I sat there with tears running down my face, listening to my dead sister's voice calling to me from the frozen forest, while my body fought against the restraints trying to force me to go to her. The voice continued for 18 minutes. At 3:41 a.m., it stopped. The compulsion disappeared instantly. My body relaxed. I sat there shaking, my wrist bruised and bleeding slightly from where I had pulled against the zip ties. I reviewed the laptop footage immediately. The camera showed me sitting in the chair for the entire 18 minutes, clearly struggling, clearly distressed, but never leaving. I checked the security cameras. They showed no one exiting the cabin at 3:33 a.m., but they did show something else. The footage from the forest camera, the one positioned 200 yards north of the cabin, showed a figure standing in the clearing. The same figure that had appeared in previous night's footage. Same height, same build, same posture. It was me, or something that looked exactly like me, standing in the forest for 18 minutes while I was physically restrained inside the cabin. I played the audio from the forest camera. I could hear the voice calling my name. I could hear Emma's voice, but I could also hear something else. A second voice, speaking in a language I did not recognize, overlapping with Emma's voice, like two radio stations playing at once. I called my advisor again at 6 a.m. and told him everything. The sleepwalking, the security footage, the voice, the restraints, the duplicate figure in the forest. He listened without interrupting, then told me to pack my essentials and activate the emergency beacon immediately. He said a helicopter would extract me as soon as weather permitted, likely within 24 hours. I spent that day packing and reviewing all my footage and data, trying to document everything before I left. I found something in the historical records for the research site. The cabin had been operational since 2018, and I was the 7th researcher to be assigned there for extended stays. I contacted the previous 6 researchers through university email, asking if they had experienced anything unusual during their time at the cabin. 4 of them responded. 3 said their stays had been completely normal. The 4th, a doctoral candidate named Sarah Kim, who had been there in March 2022, said she had experienced similar episodes but had attributed them to carbon monoxide exposure from a faulty heater. She had reported it. The heater had been serviced, and the issue was supposed to have been resolved. I checked the cabin's maintenance records. The heater had been inspected after Sarah's report and found to be functioning perfectly. No carbon monoxide issues detected. Sarah had included her sensor data in her final report, and I pulled it up. At exactly 3:33 a.m. on multiple nights during her stay, the sensors had recorded identical anomalies to what I was experiencing. Temperature spikes, electromagnetic interference, seismic tremors, all lasting 18 minutes. Sarah had dismissed it as equipment malfunction related to the carbon monoxide issue, but there had never been a carbon monoxide issue. The helicopter arrived on December 10th at 2 p.m. I loaded my gear and my hard drives with all the research data. As we lifted off, I looked down at the cabin and the surrounding forest. In the clearing where the security camera had filmed that figure, there was someone standing there, looking up at the helicopter. I grabbed binoculars and focused on the figure. It looked exactly like me. Back in Fairbanks, I took the footage to the university's neurology department. They ran every test they could think of: MRI, EEG, sleep studies, psychological evaluations. The MRI showed something unusual: minor scarring on my hippocampus and frontal lobe, consistent with what one neurologist described as external electromagnetic influence. She said the scarring pattern was similar to what had been documented in a handful of cases involving people who claimed to have experienced missing time or unexplained compulsions near areas with strong natural electromagnetic fields. The university launched an investigation into the research site. They sent a team out in January 2024 to collect data and assess whether the location was safe for future researchers. The team reported no anomalies during their 3-day visit. All sensor readings were normal. No unusual electromagnetic activity. No temperature spikes. No seismic tremors. They recommended the site remain active for research, but they also noted that no anomalies had occurred at 3:33 a.m. because no one had stayed overnight. They had only been there during daylight hours. I withdrew from the doctoral program in March 2024, changed my field of study to urban planning, and moved to Seattle. I do not do field work anymore. I do not stay in remote locations, and I will never forget standing in that cabin, restrained to a chair, listening to my dead sister call my name while something that looked exactly like me stood in the forest waiting for 18 minutes. Waiting for what? I still do not know, and I'm grateful I never found out. I am a commercial fisherman. Have been working the waters around Kodiak Island for about 22 years now, running a 38-foot salmon seiner called the North Star. The work is hard, the hours are brutal, and the money is unpredictable, but it is the only life I have ever known. In August 2018, my uncle Raymond passed away and left me his property in his will. A small island about 40 miles southwest of Kodiak, maybe 15 acres total, with an old cabin that he had built back in the 1970s when he first moved to Alaska. I had visited the island maybe twice as a kid, remembered it being beautiful in a desolate way. Nothing but rocks and beach grass and the constant sound of waves. Raymond had lived there alone for nearly 30 years, only coming to town every few weeks for supplies. He died of a heart attack in the cabin, and the authorities did not find him for almost a week. By the time the will was processed and the property transferred to my name, it was already late August, and I was finishing up the salmon season. I decided to visit the island on August 24th to inventory what Raymond had left behind and figure out whether I wanted to keep the property or sell it. The place was completely off-grid. No electricity except for a small solar panel setup. No running water except for rain catchment. No neighbors within 15 miles. I loaded my boat with enough supplies for 3 days and made the trip from Kodiak Harbor, arriving at the island around 2 p.m. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Small, maybe 400 square feet, with weathered gray siding and a green metal roof. Inside was basic furniture, a wood stove, shelves lined with books, and evidence of Raymond's solitary life. Canned goods, fishing gear, hand tools, journals. I spent the first afternoon sorting through his belongings, boxing up anything that seemed valuable or sentimental, and making notes about repairs the cabin would need if I decided to keep it. That evening, while going through a stack of journals on a shelf by his bed, I found Raymond's final entries. The last journal covered the 3 months before his death, and the entries became increasingly strange as the dates progressed. In May 2018, Raymond wrote about finding carved stones on the beach. He described them as smooth river rocks with symbols etched into them, symbols he did not recognize. He had collected about a dozen of them and brought them back to the cabin to study. By June, Raymond was writing about something he called the shape in the water. He described seeing a figure standing in the ocean about 100 yards offshore, visible at dawn and dusk, standing chest deep in water, completely motionless. He wrote that at first he thought it was a rock formation he had never noticed before, but then he realized it moved positions. Not swimming or walking, just appearing in different locations along the shoreline. Always the same distance from the beach, always standing perfectly still. Raymond's entries from July became more detailed and more disturbed. He wrote that the shape appeared every single day now, that it seemed to be watching the cabin, that it never moved during the hours it was visible but would be in a different position each time it appeared. He drew sketches in the margins of the journal pages, rough drawings of a humanoid figure, tall and thin, standing upright in water. The proportions were wrong in the drawings. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large. Raymond wrote that he had tried to approach it in his skiff, rowing out to where it stood. But as he got within 50 yards, the figure would sink into the water and disappear. He would circle the area for hours, looking for it, but it would be gone until the next dawn. The final entries from August were short and frantic. Raymond wrote that the shape had been there for 47 consecutive days, that it was getting closer to shore, that the carved stones he had found were some kind of marker or warning. His last entry was dated August 17, 2018, 1 day before his death. He wrote that the shape had been standing in the water all night, visible in the moonlight, and that it was now only 50 yards from the beach. He wrote that he was going to confront it, that he was going to demand answers, that he was tired of being watched. The entry ended there. I sat in that cabin, reading these entries as the sun set, trying to make sense of what my uncle had experienced. The rational part of my brain said he had been suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations, that living alone for 30 years had finally taken its toll on his mental health. But something about the detailed observations, the careful drawings, the progressive deterioration of his writing style suggested he believed absolutely in what he was describing. I went outside and walked down to the beach, looking at the water in the fading light. The ocean was calm, the tide coming in, small waves breaking against the rocky shore. I saw nothing unusual. No shapes, no figures, just water. I spent that night in the cabin sleeping poorly, waking up several times to sounds that were probably just the wind or the building settling. At dawn, around 5:45 a.m. on August 25th, I went outside to watch the sunrise. The sky was clear, the air cold, maybe 45 degrees, and the ocean was flat calm. That is when I saw it. About 100 yards offshore, standing in water that should have been at least 15 feet deep, was a figure, a shape. Exactly as Raymond had described. It was humanoid, standing upright, with the water level at approximately chest height. The figure was dark, silhouetted against the lighter sky, and completely motionless. I stood there on the beach staring at it for maybe 5 minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing. My first thought was that it was a rock formation, some kind of sea stack I had not noticed the evening before. But the water depth was wrong. I knew this area. I had fished these waters for 2 decades. There were no rocks that tall in that location. I went back to the cabin and grabbed Raymond's binoculars, focused them on the figure. Through the magnification, I could see more details. The shape was definitely not a rock. It had defined edges, a clear outline, and what appeared to be limbs. Arms hanging at its sides, a head that was too large for the body, and it was watching the cabin. I could not see eyes or facial features from that distance, but the head was oriented directly toward me. I watched it for an hour. It did not move, did not sway with the current, did not bob with the small waves, just stood there, perfectly still, in water that should have made standing impossible. At 7 a.m., I decided to do what Raymond had done. I went to my boat, started the engine, and motored out toward the figure. As I got closer, within maybe 75 yards, I could see it more clearly. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with proportions that were completely wrong for any animal I knew. The arms were too long, reaching down below where the knees should be. The head was bulbous and featureless. At 50 yards, I slowed the boat, feeling this overwhelming sense of wrongness, every instinct telling me to turn back. The figure remained motionless. I kept approaching. At 40 yards, I could see the water around it. There were no ripples, no disturbance, like the figure was not actually in the water, but somehow above it. At 30 yards, it moved. Not quickly, just a slow sinking motion like it was descending into the ocean. The head disappeared first, then the shoulders, then nothing. The water, where it had been standing, showed no splash, no waves, no bubbles. It was just gone. I circled the area for the next 2 hours, using my depth finder to check the bottom. The water was 18 feet deep in that location. Nothing showed on the sonar. No large objects, no anomalies, nothing that could explain what I had just seen. I returned to the cabin and started packing immediately. I did not care about the inventory, did not care about Raymond's belongings. I just wanted off that island. But as I was loading my boat, I noticed something on the beach that had not been there the night before. Carved stones, dozens of them, scattered along the high tide line in a pattern that formed a rough circle around where I had pulled my boat onto the beach. The same stones Raymond had written about. Smooth river rocks with symbols etched into them. I photographed them, then kicked them back into the water. I launched my boat and headed back toward Kodiak, looking back at the island as I gained distance. The figure was there again, standing in the water near the beach, in daylight now, at 11 a.m., clearly visible, standing where the carved stones had been, watching me leave. I made it back to Kodiak by 1 p.m. and went straight to the Coast Guard station. Told them what I had seen, showed them the photos of the carved stones, showed them Raymond's journal entries. They listened politely, filed a report, and said they would send a patrol boat to check the area. They found nothing. No figure in the water. No carved stones on the beach. The cabin was searched and determined to be safe, with no evidence of recent disturbance except for my own presence. I listed the island for sale within a week and sold it at a significant loss to a developer who planned to build a fishing lodge. I told the new owners about Raymond's journal entries, about what I had seen, but they dismissed it as local legend or misidentification of natural phenomena. The lodge was never built. The new owners visited the island twice, then abandoned the project. The property has changed hands 3 times since 2018, and no one has stayed there longer than a single night. The island is currently listed again, price reduced to almost nothing, but there are no buyers. I still fish the waters around Kodiak, but I will not go within 10 miles of that island. And I will never forget watching that figure stand in the water, motionless for hours, watching Raymond's cabin, watching me, waiting for something I am grateful I never discovered. I work as a wilderness survival instructor. Have been teaching outdoor skills for about 11 years now, running courses in cold weather camping, navigation, emergency shelter construction, and backcountry survival techniques. Most of my clients are people preparing for expeditions, hunting trips, or just wanting to build confidence in remote environments. Part of my professional development involves regularly testing new gear and techniques in real conditions, which means spending a lot of time alone in the wilderness pushing equipment to its limits. In March 2022, I planned a 5-day solo winter endurance test at a friend's cabin near Tahkeetna, about 85 miles north of Anchorage. My friend Sarah owned the property, but rarely used it during winter, and she had given me permission to stay there while I tested a new line of cold weather sleeping bags and clothing systems I was considering recommending to my students. The cabin was small but well built, maybe 500 square feet, with good insulation, a propane heater as backup, and a wood stove for primary heat. Sarah had warned me that the place had been sitting unused since November, so I should expect it to be cold and might need to do some basic cleaning when I arrived. I drove up on March 14th, parked my truck about a quarter mile from the cabin where the road became impassable, and snowshoed in with my gear. The temperature was around 25 degrees, perfect for the kind of testing I wanted to do. I spent the first day getting the cabin warmed up, cleaning out mouse droppings, checking that the propane system worked, and organizing my gear for the week. My plan was straightforward: spend each night testing different sleep systems, document their performance in varying temperature conditions, and use the days to test clothing layers during physical activity like splitting firewood and hiking. Everything was normal for the first 2 days. I maintained detailed notes about gear performance, temperature readings, and my own comfort levels. On the morning of March the 17th, my third day, I noticed something odd when I woke up. My coffee mug, which I had left on the kitchen counter the night before, was now on the small table in the center of the room. Not a big deal. I assumed I had moved it during a middle-of-the-night bathroom trip and forgotten about it. But then I noticed the firewood. I had stacked about 20 pieces next to the wood stove before going to bed, arranged haphazardly because I was tired. Now they were neatly restacked, alternating directions in a crisscross pattern like someone had spent time organizing them properly. I stood there looking at that wood stack, trying to remember if I had done that. I had no memory of it, but I had been exhausted the previous evening, so maybe I had reorganized them without really thinking about it. That afternoon, I made a sandwich for lunch, left the plate on the counter, and went outside to split more firewood for about an hour. When I came back inside, my bed was made. Not just straightened, but properly made with hospital corners, and the sleeping bag folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I had definitely left it unmade. I had been testing a specific sleeping bag that required documenting exactly how it performed over multiple nights without washing or resetting, so I never made the bed during gear tests. I checked the door, locked from the inside exactly as I had left it. The windows were all latched. There was no evidence of anyone else being there. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and my snowshoe tracks were the only ones leading to or from the cabin. I called Sarah on my satellite phone and asked if anyone else had keys to the cabin, or if she had sent someone to check on me. She said no, that I was the only person who should be there, and that she had not told anyone else about my trip. I decided to set up a test. Before I went to bed on March 17th, I deliberately left things in specific positions. Coffee mug on the left side of the counter, 4 pieces of firewood scattered randomly near the stove, my jacket thrown over the back of a chair, my boots placed at odd angles by the door. I took photos of everything with my phone, documenting the exact placement. Then I went to bed around 10 p.m. I woke up naturally around 6:30 a.m. on March 18th. The coffee mug was on the table. The firewood was neatly stacked. My jacket was hanging properly on the coat hook by the door. My boots were lined up perfectly parallel to each other. I compared the morning scene to the photos from the night before. Everything had been moved and organized while I slept. I had heard nothing, had not woken up during the night, had no memory of getting out of bed. That morning, I set up my phone to record video while I went outside for my daily gear testing hike. I positioned it on a shelf with a view of the main room, started recording, and left the cabin for 2 hours. When I returned and reviewed the footage, I watched myself. I watched myself come back into the cabin after only 20 minutes, even though I knew I had been gone for 2 hours. I watched myself move around the cabin, picking up items, cleaning surfaces, organizing supplies. My movements were deliberate and methodical, but somehow wrong. I was not acting naturally. My face was visible in a few frames where I passed near the camera. My eyes were open, but I looked asleep. My expression was blank, completely neutral, like I was a puppet going through motions. I watched myself fold a blanket that I had left on the couch, place it in the storage chest, then return to the couch and sit down for exactly 3 minutes before standing up and walking out the door. The timestamp showed this version of me left the cabin at 9:47 a.m. I knew I had not returned to the cabin until 11:30 a.m. I was terrified. I called Sarah immediately and told her I was experiencing something I could not explain. Told her about the video, about the organized items, about watching myself do things I had no memory of doing. She listened carefully and then asked me a question that made everything worse. She asked if I had been speaking during the video. I had not noticed audio in my panic about seeing myself moving unconsciously. I played the video again with the sound on. I could hear myself talking, speaking in complete sentences in what sounded like Russian. I do not speak Russian. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school and college. I've never studied Russian, never been to Russia, have no Russian heritage or connections. But in that video, I was speaking fluent Russian while organizing the cabin in a trance-like state. I downloaded the video to my laptop and sent it to Sarah via satellite internet. Then I called a friend who spoke Russian, a woman named Katya, who had immigrated from Moscow in the 1990s. I sent her the audio file and asked her to translate what I was saying. Katya called me back 30 minutes later. She said I was describing the cabin's layout, giving detailed directions about the room configuration, the location of the door, the windows, the wood stove. I was saying things like, the bed is against the north wall. She sleeps facing the window. The door is unlocked at night. The wood stove creates a blind spot from the door. I was giving information to someone, describing where I was sleeping, how to access the cabin, what my routines were. Katya said my pronunciation was perfect, my grammar was correct, and I spoke with what she identified as a Moscow accent from the 1940s or 1950s. Not modern Russian, but an older dialect that was common during the Stalin era. I asked Sarah about the cabin's history. She said her grandfather had built it in 1946 after immigrating to Alaska from somewhere in Europe. She did not know much about his background except that he had been part of some kind of work program during World War II and had come to Alaska immediately after the war ended. I started researching the property records that evening, using the satellite internet. The original land claim was filed in 1946 by a man named Dmitry Volkov, Sarah's grandfather. Further research revealed that Dmitry Volkov had been part of a Soviet intelligence network operating in Alaska during the 1940s. The cabin had been used as a safe house for operatives moving between the Soviet Union and North America during the early Cold War period. In 1951, 3 people died in the cabin during what official records described as a territorial dispute between competing intelligence agencies. Their bodies had been found by hunters 2 months after the incident. All 3 had been shot. The case was never solved because of the political complications of investigating Soviet intelligence operations on U.S. soil. The names of the dead were listed in the declassified FBI file I found online. Mikhail Petrov, Anya Sokolova, and Viktor Romanov, all Soviet citizens, all intelligence operatives, all killed in the cabin I was currently occupying. I packed my gear within an hour. I was not staying another night. As I was loading my backpack, I found something I had not packed. A small notebook old and water-stained, hidden under the mattress of the bed. The pages were filled with Cyrillic writing. I could not read it, but I photographed every page and sent them to Kanya. She called me the next day after I had evacuated the cabin and driven back to Anchorage. The notebook was a surveillance log. It documented people who had stayed at the cabin, their routines, their vulnerabilities, their schedules. The entries were written by Anya Sokolova, dated between 1949 and 1951. The final entry was dated March 15, 1951. Anya wrote that she had been compromised, that her cover was blown, that she was waiting for extraction, but expected violence instead. She wrote instructions for the next operative who would use the cabin, describing how to observe targets, how to gather information, how to remain undetected while living among Americans. Katya said the notebook entries matched exactly what I'd been saying in the video. I had been reciting Anya's surveillance instructions word for word, in her voice, using her accent, while unconsciously organizing the cabin the way she would have organized it 71 years earlier. Sarah sold the cabin 6 months later. She disclosed the history to the buyers, told them about my experience, showed them the declassified documents about the deaths. The new owners demolished the structure and built a modern vacation home on the property. They reported no unusual experiences. I stopped doing solo gear testing. I will not stay alone in remote cabins anymore. And I destroyed the footage of myself speaking Russian in that trance state, because watching it made me feel like I was not alone in my own body, like something from 1951 was still in that cabin, still gathering intelligence, still preparing for an extraction that would never come.